Welcome to Act and Unwind, an ongoing conversation on a free and virtuous society. I'm your host, Eric Cohn. I want to thank you for listening. I want to ask that if you're listening to us on our website, that you navigate right now to the show notes for this episode, where you're going to find a link to subscribe directly to Act and Unwind at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else where you listen to fine podcasts. And if you like this program, please leave us a 5-star review at Apple Podcasts so as to help more people find our show. Today, I'm joined by Dan Huger, Acton's librarian and a research associate, and Dylan Palman, executive editor of the Journal of Markets and Morality and a research fellow here at Acton. And this week, we're joined by a special guest, James Patterson. James is associate professor of politics and chair of the politics department at Ave Maria University. He's also a research fellow at the Center for Religion, Democracy, and Culture, and president of the Ciceronian Society, an ecumenical fellowship of Christian scholars. He is the author of the essay, Is the New Right Fascist?, which appears in the summer 2023 issue of our magazine, Religion and Liberty, which is available on Barnes & Noble and Books A Million newsstands across the country, and is also published online today at acton.org. And we will, of course, include a link to that in the show notes for this episode. So welcome, James. This week, we'll be discussing David Brooks's recent column in the New York Times asking if elites, quote, are the bad guys. But first, let's start with the question of James's piece. But before I think we get to the question of is the new right fascist, James, I want to ask you, and you do define this in the piece, but since anybody who has been an observer of the rhetoric in our culture, certainly over the last 8 years or so, but this is, in truth, a much more long-run problem, I think would probably agree with the observation that the word fascism has come to mean what George Orwell said, that fascism has come to mean that which is not desirable. Can you define for us what is fascism and how should we think about it in the context of a conversation like this? And then we can get into the question of, is the new right fascist?
Well, thank you very much for having me on. I listen to this podcast regularly, and I will have listeners know that I have stopped streaming it off the browser. I have it subscribed to in my. Don't forget to rate 5 stars and leave a comment.
We and our metrics, thank you.
Well, the Ciceronian Society is a podcast too, so once you're on this side of the production, you're like, oh no, this really matters. So please, I endorse doing this. So the trouble we run into with fascism is, as I say in the opening of the piece, that there has been on the left a tendency to call all conservatism in the United States a type of fascism, and it can get pretty silly. I think the joke is that, you went to school? Well, guess who else went to school? Fascists. And so that's
guess who else was a vegetarian, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a case of false positives. And the reason that this term gets used is that fascism is really bad. So you want to associate someone with something that's really bad, but it's also a particular thing. So what I mean by this is all you're really trying to say is conservatism is bad, and you're bad for being conservative. But fascism is a particular kind of badness that often American conservatives simply do not overlap with in the slightest. The reason for this is that American conservatism has normally been based off the idea of free markets, religious life, freely chosen according to rights of conscience, opposition to totalitarian government, and self-government or constitutionalism of some variety. And fascism really doesn't like any of that, except maybe religious conservatism, but in a sense where it's imposed by the state. So there's actually in American conservatism very little overlap. The criteria that I adopt from a scholar of fascism named Robert Paxton is the particular things that make fascism distinct as a kind of bad thing is obsessive preoccupation with decline, humiliation, or victimhood, a cult of unity, energy, and purity, uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites, and an abandonment of liberty to pursue redemptive violence or coercion by the state. And again, historically, American conservatism hasn't really liked any of this. And that has a lot to do with the peculiarities of American conservatism, sort of adopting constitutional republicanism from the American founding, opposition to communism after the end of the Second World War, standing up for religious faith during a time when the left was in favor of secularization. So American conservatism is very unique in this respect. One might even call it exceptional, but it's we don't use that term anymore.
So without further ado, I'll let you address the thrust of your piece then. So as we're looking at the new right, and I'll add as well, we recently had on a different topic, Jonah Goldberg on this podcast. And of course, Jonah, his first book was entitled Liberal Fascism. And I, as a reader and a fan of that book, kind of appreciated part of what he was doing there, which was the, and anybody, as I think you alluded to, who's on the right, if you haven't been called a fascist yourself, in all likelihood, the people that you have read and respect and admire have been called a fascist at some point in time. And Jonah's one of the larger points in his book was to point out that fascism, at least as it manifested in, say, Nazi Germany and coming out of Mussolini's Italy, where Mussolini was a socialist beforehand, was to point out the economic platform, and a lot of the platform of these movements was, in American terms, left-wing. I've heard Jonah comment that, he had not appreciated what we would be seeing in the change in the political right in the United States over, the last 10 years or so, which has led him to, I think, revise part of his thesis. So I'll ask the thrust of your question about the thrust of your piece. How should we think about the new right, and is the new right fascist?
So when I wrote this article, I wrote it in a way that was intended to correct for my own biases. I am not a fan or a part of what's calling itself the new right. I think sort of on the more eggheady academic side of criticism of it for some time. And so I decided to write with an understanding that there's a way of maybe defending at least some of this stuff, especially from people who seem to be very genuine and sincere about their positive vision for what this movement can do. And the person who I really try to look to as that figure is Yoram Hazony of the Edmund Burke Foundation, or led the national conservatism stuff. Israeli scholar, wrote a couple books, Virtue and Nationalism, and a book on conservatism. And a few days, I think, after I submitted the final draft of this essay, at the same time I was submitting final grades. So I apologize to everyone involved. I was very preoccupied. So a lot of this was written over cigars in a classic Jonah Goldberg fashion.
Yeah, not that there's anything wrong with that.
No, there's. That's what I kept telling myself. This is really the good life.
Yes.
People should have my problems. People who are like doing underwater welding are like, oh, okay, yeah, you're really struggling. So a few days after I submitted the final draft, there was a person who's associated with the American Reformer who posted that we needed a Protestant Franco. And I was like, oh, you could have maybe said that a little earlier. So I could have included that in the piece because that's actually a pretty significant pivot where people start to edge themselves into saying the names of people who were affirmatively fascist in their vision for their country. Someone like Francisco Franco was, as a person who was part of the nationalist side of the very bloody Spanish Civil War and the Falangist party that was imitating fascism in Italy. So the new right has a problem that I stipulate in the piece, namely that there is no limiting factor to the arguments that they're making. And the reason for this is that they are always concerned about a state of emergency. There is a sense of decline, at which point we will no longer be able to go back. And they think we are at this inflection mark. And you will see this in some of the quotations in which I have a few people, including Glenn Elmers, who simply insist we can no longer call ourselves conservatives. We have to be something else. Well, unfortunately, the only other thing you can call yourself historically on the right is a reactionary, and reactionaries and fascists engage in a form of counter-revolutionary violence on the basis of decline. And the source of that decline is supposed to be liberalism. And that is the kind of language we get from people like Patrick Deneen, who I don't think is any student of Mussolini's speeches. I think he comes by this argument for why liberalism failed in 2018, as well as in Regime Change, which I've read. He also has this. It opens up with a very bleak picture of the United States. That what this then means is that we can no longer tolerate so-called liberal ideas of constitutional republicanism. We need to take direct action, and we need someone who will take that action for us. So what I say is that there's no limiting principle to what that person might be. And the reason for this is that there's no limiting principle to the opposition. So they hope that they might be able to use oppositional frames of government, oppositional tools for their own sake in order to prevail in some kind of ultimate victory over liberalism. So any idea of conserving the constitutional order has gone out the window. And unfortunately, there's only one way to go with that. And so at that point, what you're really dealing with is the willingness of new right leadership to essentially constrain people from saying things they shouldn't. And Yoram Hazony has been that person, but it seems like he's not really in control of anything anymore. So we're now seeing some pretty dramatic statements made by people in the new right about how far we can really go with this.
One of the interesting things, James, about this essay, it's a wonderful essay, sort of top to bottom, is it's very historically grounded and historically conscious. And you divide up in looking at this, there is a European fascist tradition, and then there is a sort of imported fascism that has existed in America since the 30s and the 40s. In what ways do you think the present sort of new right, although it's not, as sort of according to Hoyle fascism, it's particularly resonant with this American strain that precedes it in the 30s and 40s? That's a fascinating story in that piece, and I was wondering if you could unpack that a little bit for our listeners.
Oh, sure. I thought about it doing it in my previous answer, but I think I had been speaking for 45 minutes. So I to calm it down. So
we can turn this into a Joe Rogan episode. That's fine.
Well, we are talking about cigars. He regularly smokes them on set. Yes. I'm in my my office on campus at Ave Maria. So there might be some fire code violations. Worth it. So American fascism is very strange, and often Americans are not aware of this history because we normally understand America as a liberal power that intervened on the side of the English, who were fighting against the Axis powers and had to make this sort of devil's bargain with communists in the Soviet Union. And the truth is that America had a very complicated relationship with fascism. I mean, FDR liked Mussolini. There was a defender of Hitler within his cabinet, and Joseph P. Kennedy. Father Coughlin was a friend of Joseph P. Kennedy, and he was a vocal defender of fascism in his radio addresses and in his magazine. And in a political party that he started to kind of defend it. That's called the Christian Front. The magazine was called Social Justice. I think the radio show was called The Hour of Power. And then there were silver shirts, the Bund. I don't think the Bund made it into I just thought it was too long to include them. And of course, Charles Lindbergh, the America First movement. These were all organizations that were in favor of fascist government. And the argument that they made, and the most important one, was that it was anti-communist, and the communists are the real enemy. And in a way, that's just true. Like, communism was probably the more serious threat to the United States. But the thing that often people don't realize is that these fascists in the United States were also pacifists, or at least anti-militarists. I guess I shouldn't call them pacifists. They were in favor of American non-intervention. They liked the idea of America sticking to its side of the planet and not intervening in any European war. Now, the reason they did this was because they were either fellow travelers or, in some cases, in Coughlin's case, there were people who were actually unregistered foreign agents for the Nazi Party. And some of them were useful idiots for fascists that were importing this message to the United States to keep it out of the conflict until fascist powers in Europe could control all the territory they wanted. It was a way of discouraging American interest, and there was a willing audience for this. There were, of course, people who remembered how bad it was after the First World War. There are people who are German, they're German immigrants or German descended families in the Midwest, who also remember that the last liberal internationalist, Woodrow Wilson, sent vigilantes into their communities or at least approved of their interventions in order to smash up German language newspapers. Irish Catholics who really liked Mussolini for the Lateran Treaty of 1929, and also sided with Franco because the Spanish Republicans were engaged in wholesale liquidation of Catholic priests and religious. So it's not everyone that is opposed to the fascists on their own. I should also mention that there are elites, like, a very high-ranking Nazi is a Harvard graduate who comes to the United States at the invitation of his own Harvard class. Originally, he was going to be one of the people in charge of running it and was going to have a very prominent place on a dais until they think otherwise. And you even have Dulles at the time, John Foster Dulles, who's defending these regimes, especially Germany, because he represents commercial interests that are recouping money from the previous war and hoping that they might be able to continue profitable business arrangements under Hitler. John D. Wilsey has a very powerful opening image in his book on Dulles, in which he's going through the archives in Princeton, and he just finds this picture of Dulles shaking hands with a smiling Hitler. He's like, what is going on, right? So America liked fascism on some levels. They certainly preferred it to communism. And so they were willing to, give a hearing to this anti-interventionism message. And the reason that this is relevant to the question about the New Right is that the New Right is also very anti-interventionist.
Mm-hmm. And that has an earlier, one thing I want to tell listeners is I interviewed John Wilsey about this book on the Act and Line program, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes because it's a fascinating story of John Foster Dulles.
Amazing, isn't it?
It's great.
Wilsey can make even Dulles interesting.
And he also
a little too close to reality in the marketing in that name, right? Dulles, yeah.
and a fascinating
truth in advertising.
It's actually Latin for interesting.
Yeah.
Oh my Lord.
The other thing is this has some resonance with the earlier American Republican tradition of anti-interventionism, which is one of the ways that these sorts of people with these dubious business interests, with these statuses for as agents, these sort of useful idiots, will then peddle to a broader American audience that might be, hostile to fascism in principle, but is also sort of a committed non-interventionist in a sort of historical American sense. So they find an audience.
Yes.
For these other things, using that as leverage. And I think you see that a lot in the New Right today. You get a lot of times when there are criticisms of folks on the New Right, they will come back with, well, what about the Iraq War? And this is something used to devalue and dismiss criticisms of their opponents as an attempt, a sort of whataboutism, interconservative whataboutism.
Well, I think you need to add too in the case of the Iraq War, one of the things that always annoys me, and this is a bit of a hobby horse of mine, so I'm just going to state it, and then nobody needs to address it if they don't want to, but the revisionist history that goes into the telling of all of that, you had pretty much every intelligence agency in the world. Now, if we want to just say we shouldn't trust any intelligence agency around the world, that's a perfectly fine argument, and I'm happy to have it. But there was wide agreement on the predicate for the Iraq War, and there's this eternal effort to try to make it into, what I find interesting, I should say, is the right adopting the left's argument from the time, which was that this was a war for oil, that it was a war for the purpose of having a war, that just kind of ignores the reality on the ground that those of us who lived through that period of time, I think, will recall. This is one of the things that just annoys me about the nature of that conversation. Look, was it wrong in retrospect? Yes, in retrospect. The predicate of, they had weapons of mass destruction and we needed to do something about it turned out not to be true. But the retelling of it that makes it into this nefarious thing, instead of just, accepting as the British would say, cock up before conspiracy, I find deeply frustrating. And that enters so much into this conversation that has fueled so many of this non-interventionist argument, which I have sympathies with. But I think at least should be grounded in real history rather than this retelling that we're getting about that period of time.
I just mentioned that I actually opposed the intervention in Iraq. And the very first thing I ever wrote was on this, and it wasn't out of some sort of like brandishing my humanitarian, left wing sort of credentials. It's that I compared it to the invasion of Sicily in the Peloponnesian War, where it felt like a diversion from the original mission. So I get to say with all credibility that the contemporary new right anti-interventionism is often more of a kind of principled opposition to America as an institution or as a country or as a internally consistent set of beliefs than it is to any kind of strategic vision for America's position abroad. You always have this argument, well, we can't get too bogged down in Russia because China's the real enemy. But then you read people like Sohrab Ahmari or other people on the new right talking about how we need to be comfortable with China achieving its own spheres of interest and its own regional hegemony. And so that if the Russian invasion of Ukraine comes to an end, we know what the position is going to be once China is the, quote, focus, which is it's going to be accommodationism. So I don't accept that the new right position is going to be hard on China and soft on Russia. I think it's soft on whatever the most urgent international concern for the United States is.
I think it also bears mentioning that a not inconsiderable amount of it, not all, and there were positions like the one that you just articulated, James, that were perfectly reasonable and good to argue at that period of time. But I think there are also just a lot of deeply politically interested people who looked at the consequences of the Iraq War to particularly the Republican Party, that it led to the decline in popularity of George W. Bush and then the rise in election of Barack Obama, who was opposed to the war and campaigned a lot on that, even going back to when he was first campaigning for the U.S. Senate in 2004. That I just see as a political reaction to a failure of a presidency, rather than any kind of deep principled position on intervention or non-interventionism.
Absolutely.
So I'm curious. You mentioned the wide variety of interests, and particularly non-military interventionist interests, that motivated sympathy towards fascist regimes in the 40s. But how much of that, like, how do we parse out what of that do you actually call itself fascist, or what of that was simply like a convenient thing? Because there's a lot of people who are pacifists for a lot of reasons, and then to bring that up to the present, I probably was less pacifist 20 years ago when we invaded Iraq. So one of my first community college editorials was not quite defending it, but it was defending against some criticism of we're going in for oil. I was like, hey, I haven't seen any benefit of the gas pump yet.
If anybody wants to go dig through my college newspaper columns, you'll find some pretty full-throated defenses of the war in Iraq that I don't agree with anymore. But right. we were all young once,
right? And so, but I'm probably definitely more anti-interventionist now. I'm sympathetic to some of the frustration people have had, especially with Afghanistan, actually, with how badly that pullout went. And I did write in a pretty heavy-handed way about that. But so there's people today that are just, they're seeing things, they're disappointed maybe with, you could go all the way back to Vietnam with, failures from the United States military efforts, wasted resources, lost lives of, in many cases, family members, friends. That's true of, our generation with the war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan. We all know somebody who went over there. Some of us know people who didn't come back. And I could see people just being kind of frustrated on that end. And then you can combine that domestically with, to use like Bernie Sanders' phrase, this idea that we have a sort of like casino economy, that everything is kind of rigged for the house, right? That there's a certain elite class, and they're just kind of pulling the strings for themselves, and the little guy gets left behind. These are understandable frustrations, and I think just being frustrated with these things, however right or wrong we may consider the basis, doesn't make someone a fascist, right? There has to be steps beyond that. So how do we parse that out?
So one thing that was a great, I won't even try to repeat anything about the contemporary concerns. That was a very good summary. I'd only add that you'll frequently have invoked like George Washington's farewell address, in which he talks about the need for religion and education, but for Americans to stay completely out of any kind of foreign interventions, because we'll have to take sides. When we take sides, we'll be alienating interests, and we'll also be spending blood and treasure on outcomes that do not benefit us. So there's even at the earliest stages of the American Republic, a hostility to the idea of American intervention abroad. Now, what facilitates that period from Washington's farewell address, we do try to take sides during the War 1812 with results that Washington anticipated, not great. So what we do instead is we adopt the Monroe Doctrine, in which we, essentially say colonial powers go home. And then we engage in a kind of interior empire building through Conquest West. But we stay mostly out of any kind of exterior. We're not colonizing. We're not doing the scramble for Africa. And it's not until the Spanish-American War where things really change. And even then we kind of end up with the Philippines because no one will take it. So, there's a lot of there's a lot of history for America to have a presumptive opposition to intervention abroad. And it's right to say that the contemporary moment of the New Right is an attempt to essentially reckon with the Bush presidency, a reckoning that was never actually allowed. In the 2012 people don't remember this, or they're too young to remember this. So a lot of the people in the New Right are very young, so they don't know this stuff. But the 2012 nomination campaign was not really ready to even reckon with this. And this is many years after Bush. So it's only now. It was really only in 2016 where anyone in the Republican Party was allowed to express hostility to the Iraq War, at which point everyone in the Republican Party voted against it. It's like the funny thing is that suddenly everyone was against it because it was unpopular, even though if you go back on the voting record, everyone was for it then. But the only person who could credibly critique it was Trump, because he didn't have a voting history, and so he could sort of be skeptical of these sorts of things. So this is the person who a lot of people look to for interest on this. And what does this have to do with the New Right? Well, the New Right was attempting to articulate an alternative vision of conservatism that fit with his priorities and his perspectives, and articulated a new vision of conservatism that was freed from the baggage of the Reagan, Bush sort of history. And this was done very intentionally. A sort of cri de coeur of the New Right was something called Against the Dead Consensus, which was published in First Things. And this is a starting point for the attempt to create a new version of that conservatism that's oddly nationalist, but also less interventionist.
I wonder, James, if you could dial in on a couple aspects of something you just said there, which is that this New Right has this disproportionately young. And I want to go back to something that you said, I think, in response to my first question, which was there's this belief, and I've certainly heard this plenty too, about, things are so bad now. We were in such a decline. What is conservatism conserved? We can't call ourselves conservatives anymore because we need more radical solutions to that. And I found these, in not every case, but in a lot of cases, these coming from very young people who, at minimum, just do not have the lived historical perspective that I think, to borrow a nice little saying that I cannot remember who, we're born into this world completely ignorant and only get less so as we get less young. But we hear these kind of insistences that, from people who haven't lived through all that much, that it is as bad as it's ever been. It's only getting worse, and we need radical solutions. And what if you could tie that to a couple of examples that we've seen recently of some of these prominent young voices on the New Right. Nate Hochman, who has been on Acton podcasts before, who got let go from the DeSantis campaign for some role in creating a video that had some explicit Nazi imagery. And then there was this piece about Richard Hanania over the weekend. The supposed surprise of is that he had written things in favor of biological eugenics that and under a pseudonym that I don't know why anybody was surprised, because he wrote a lot of the same things under his actual name. But you certainly get the connection of eugenics back to the Nazis, back to fascism. Can you talk through a lot of this, both that kind of young feature and then what we're seeing specifically from some of those young people that has echoes of fascist themes from the past?
So there are two phrases you can use to understand what's going on with this. The first is an old phrase. It's no enemies to the right, which is very similar to no enemies to the left when communists were doing this. So no enemies to the right means that even if you are a person on the right, if you know someone who's more extreme than you, then you do not publicly criticize them. And so this approach to conservative politics is not normally the way American conservatives have conducted themselves. There's the kind of legendary exclusion of groups by the National Review. I should have called it National Review. They don't like it when you put the in front of it. But by National Review, like the
Birchers.
What was it called? The Birchers. Thank you. Yeah,
and objectivists.
And the Randians. And the kind of gatekeeping function that National Review played was a way of preserving public legitimacy for the conservative positions taken and the policy preferences of conservative political leaders, so that you don't have this. And there's been a disintermediation of the right. National Review no longer really controls this sort of thing. In fact, gatekeeping's bad, right? Like it's girl boss, gatekeep, and gas. I got the order wrong, but you don't want to. These are things you shouldn't do, right? I'm not much of a girl boss these days, but the gatekeeping function has now sort of devolved into no enemies to the right, which is why are you criticizing your own side here? You're taking theirs by doing so. And the other one I get from a person I know. Which is to own the libs shall be the whole of the law. There is a kind of juvenile glee that comes from making self-serious people online get very angry. It's essentially poking the woke bear, right? It's like, so you say things that will make people mad. It's very funny. You share the outrage online, and by retweeting it on your anon Twitter account or in your group chat or what have you. And the way that you own the libs is you get them to get angry at things that, of course, they're going to get angry at, but and it becomes a kind of competition, especially on younger people, about what they can do and get away with. And so one way to own the libs is, of course, to adopt fascist and Nazi imagery in order to get them to say, oh my gosh, just, so now the libs are owned, right? And so this approach becomes a kind of milieu in which young people who spend a lot of time online, not all young people do, but those who do, get into this sort of thing. So the next thing you know, you're putting the sun and rod in the background of a fascist march to Ron DeSantis in the advertisement you were describing before. I wasn't going to bring it up, but when we were talking about things that happened after I submitted this manuscript, but now that we're talking about it, the sun and rod is like it started as like a second or third tier Nazi image, right? It's not easily as recognizable, but you see it, and you're like, oh, that doesn't look good. As soon as you see it.
Yeah, even if you don't know the Nazi association with it, the vibe of the whole thing is not great, Bob.
People in uniforms with bayonet rifles marching in unison. You can't see their feet, so you don't know if they're goose stepping, but they are. So it's a bad vibe, like you said. And so the reason why you see this is because you have been owning the libs for so long. Now that's just what you do. That's just how you think about this. You're always incorporating images that are meant to get a lot of online excitement and engagement. And from what I understand, I read a Semaphore article about it. I apologize to the authors of that piece, whose names I can't remember. I like to shout out people that
we'll
work.
link it in the show notes.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Is that maybe I don't know? Is that maybe the original idea here was to organize the online world to get into memeing DeSantis the way people memed Trump in 2016. And of course, the reason why this was having a difficult time is DeSantis is a very different kind of candidate from Trump. It's more of a sort of capable, technical governor than a incredibly divisive yet also hilarious man who will go on Borscht Belt level tears about how he's never seen a skinny person drink Diet Coke. So that is a person you can meme. Okay, you can meme Donald Trump. The meme's right. He does the meming. All right, all you do is just retweet.
Well,
and that's
these
a very
things
difficult sign
for Trump emerged organically, and it's like this is the difference between like to go back to last week's episode of Unwind, the Barbenheimer phenomenon, which was something that was created entirely organically based on the coincidence of these films being released on the same day. And again, as the marketing guy here, I promise you right now, in corporate boardrooms all across America, there are conversations about how can we create our own kind of Barbenheimer phenomenon, and the answer is you cannot, because every attempt is going to be terrible. And it's, to me, very similar to the attempt to say, well, this thing that grew up organically around Trump worked for him, so we need to recreate it ourselves. Sometimes you just cannot do that. It needs to grow up organically.
So the way that they did it is they tried to bootstrap it with these videos that were so online that even people who are just modestly online are going to see a Nazi imagery and they're going to be like, what is going on here? If you got a Republican strategist and you're like, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to put his face in front of a Nazi symbol and with marching fascist soldiers. You're like, is this a democratic op? Is this like, are they trying to destroy this candidate? Because this is literally how opposition runs ads, right? This is like the LBJ ad on Goldwater, where they're counting down the numbers and then the nuclear bomb goes off.
Yep.
Right. So that's how bad that the attempt to recreate lightning in a bottle like that can get. But it's also a feature, and I hate to say, I'm not a doomer by any means. We were talking about young people being not terribly experienced. I think things are actually pretty okay I don't understand why there's a lot of stress. Then again, I live in Southern Florida, so it's easy for me to say. But
well, I think it's. I want to get back to getting Dillian here, but I think it is a consequence of how many of these people are so online. Christine Rosen, who we had on the podcast recently, is this great way of putting it that the problem with social media is that it has all of the downsides of living in a small town with none of the upsides of it, in that everybody's in everyone's business and things that are happening thousands of miles away that have nothing to do with you seem like immediate problems because it is in front of your eyes on a screen. So Sohrab Ahmari, when he got so fit to be tied over Drag Queen Story Hour, he was mad over something happening in Sacramento when he lived in New York City. Now, perfectly reasonable to expect that the same kind of thing was going on in New York City, but I always found it instructive that the example was thousands of miles away from him. And I think people who are so online like that see everything that is weird or bad in the world, which there's always been weird or bad things in the world, but you see so much more of it now if you are that online. And I think it poisons your brain and you lose perspective on things as a result of it.
There's one last thing. I'm sorry, Dylan.
No, that's fine.
I once had a little online spat with Sohrab, and he like quote tweeted, a quote reposted. I don't think we're allowed to call it tweeting anymore.
Elon will appear to yell at you, so yes.
Yeah, and he'll wrestle me too. He's going after Zuck. He's coming for me. So he just retweeted an emoji of a corn cob, and I got so many emails and direct messages like, what does the corn cob mean?
Yeah.
And I was like, I am so ashamed that I know what it means.
Yes.
But it just means that I lost, in his opinion, a conversation.
It's a reference to a tweet from a guy who's as the handle Drill, who is this surrealist comedian, which again, you have to be very online to get that somewhat obscure reference to a Twitter account. It just is a perfect example of how online one needs to be.
This will get worse, by the way. This will get worse because a lot of people are motivated to run on campaigns, to do the legwork for campaigns, are also very online. We saw it with the Kamala Harris campaign. It's hard. We don't remember this, but the Republicans are going to have to deal with very online, strange people who are going to, want to own the libs with Sun and Rad. All right. So if you're thinking of running for office, hire the oldest people you can find. All right, Dylan, sorry.
Yeah, no, so I just wanted to add to the owning the libs sort of thing. So as far as like fascism goes, it's the sort of thing that even when you read people at the time commenting on it, so a famous one is Umberto Eco. Dan may get to that. He wrote a good essay on it. George Orwell even. Some of my favorites are Wilhelm Röpke had a great article on fascist economics, trying to analyze that at the time, and he does kind of pull out some principles, some of which I might get to, but he talks about how hard it is really to pin it down. And to me, the person who did the best, although he was a communist and an atheist, so I don't actually support his own point of view, but Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist writer, and his book Anti-Semite and Jew, which is kind of like a long troll so he's sort of trying to own the fascists, which is a little unfortunate, but he does kind of succeed also in some ways. And he paints this portrait of how the anti-Semite behaves in an argument. So he says, at the outset, he has chosen to devaluate words and reasons. That, for him, an argument, an interaction is a game. He does not believe in words, Sartre says. It's all about just trying to get the other person to beclown themselves and make them look bad. And as you mentioned, people going after the self-serious on social media. That's people who are using social media as a serious career thing, as they think they're being informative or they're whatever, doing their social justice thing. And then you have a bunch of other people who think it's a game. And that's who they're interacting with. And he concludes in this really interesting passage. He says, if as we've been able to observe, the anti-Semite is impervious to reason, to experience, it is not because his conviction is strong. Rather, his conviction is strong because he has chosen, first of all, to be impervious. And I think there's a psychology to it that you have people So Rupka says that fascism is distinctly illiberal in the sense of being totalitarian. So there's this fundamental rejection of liberalism. And we definitely see that today. A lot of people write in books about how they're illiberal or post-liberal or whatever the case may be. And I think it comes from this dissatisfaction, I think wrongly placed, but understandably in many cases. They look at the system, whatever that is to them. They look at the elites, whoever those are to them, and they say, this whole thing is rigged. It's all corrupt. And instead of opting for, therefore, we need to become champions of the liberal order, and by liberal, I don't mean progressive. Think American founding principles. That's what I mean by liberal. The liberal order that made this country great, that allowed people to thrive for so long in so many ways, instead of saying we need to be the ones to revive that and to be the champions of that in our generation, they say we want corruption for us. That is the state of I think a lot of these people, they say the whole thing is rigged. Why can't it be rigged for us? So they're giving up. It's a psychology of people who have given up.
They've weaponized the state, and we must do so to reward our friends and punish our enemies.
Rather than saying, how can we de-weaponize the state? Right? How can we demilitarize politics? Which you think anti-interventionist people should be sympathetic to. Instead, they say, how can we get it to work for us? So Rupka mentions, he says, you end up with this kind of compromise. It's not a totalitarian in the communist sense. It preserves some aspects of individualism, but he says this monopolistic interventionist economic system, which is a result of all these conflicting forces, has the double merit of being a job-providing system for the fascist partisans, which is very important for fascism as a mass movement, and of allowing the government to claim the economic successes for itself and its marvelous foresight, and to heap all the blame on the economic shortcomings of private entrepreneurs and the liberalistic principles they represent. So it's this kind of socialization of losses, he mentions, and the government, picking winners and losers and taking credit for every economic gain, whether justified or not. In fact, he says usually not. And then every loss, they're going to just blame on the private enterprise or on liberalism or liberalistic principles. And it all becomes this weird sort of, well, not weird, but this very frightening sort of language game that at the base, it's a bunch of people with all their minds made up in the first place. They're not interested in a discussion. So my takeaway from that is that these are people who need hope, right? Because this is coming from a place of feeling powerless in the face of a system that they don't think it's working for them or the people they care about. Some of that, I think, is role playing, because a lot of these people are, in fact, like East Coast elites, and yet they're posing as if they know what the blue collar person is like. They didn't grow up. They didn't work at factories. They didn't grow up, in the neighborhood and school
Grew up in
system
suburban Connecticut.
Yeah, exactly. They don't actually know these people. I remind of like
the hard scrabble streets of suburban Connecticut.
I'm reminded of there's a scene in Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy where the lead character Levin goes to work in the fields with his former serfs. They've been liberated, but he talks about how the revolutionary of the time is always like putting them up on a pedestal, and he's like, I know these people, and he cares for them, like they're his workers, but he's like, but I also kind of like hate some of them, like they're not in the sense of like as a class and as a people, but like he knows them well enough to be annoyed by them, right? He has a familiarity that these intelligentsia don't. My position, and I have to say, I find it very admirable that you engage with these people at all, and that you put the energy into it, because it's not something I do. It's not, and it's something I don't do in part by choice, because I don't think playing the game is ever a winning proposition. And I guess I don't know what it's easy to say that I'm in the right, and it's just expended energy, but I don't always think that's the case. So one last historical example. In 1905, there was basically failed Russian Revolution. They managed to get a constitution. They got a Duma, which is like a Congress, but they really didn't have the power to make any actual laws. The Tsar was still supreme. So they got some improvement. They had political parties. They had elections, things like that. but it wasn't great. And then there was the failed Russo-Japanese War, which preceded it. So there's all these questions of how great is Russia really? In 1909, there was a group of intellectuals who published a volume called Veki, which means landmarks. And these are people that evidence a real conservative liberal tradition in Russia. They were people who were, in many cases, were former Marxists. They were members of the intelligentsia who now were critiquing it. And they were kind of taking a victory lap in that volume. There's good things there. I recommend people read it if they can find a copy. But they were kind of like, you know what, the intelligentsia, these Marxist radicals, these nihilists, you know, they've lost. And here's all the things they're wrong about. And it was this kind of, you know, here's our proposition for where else the country can go. Basically, everybody hated it, included people who should have liked it. But we don't need to get into that. The point is, 8 years later, the revolutionaries came to power. So I am personally at this weird sort of dilemma where I look at these people and I say, these are a bunch of jokers. They're like Sartre's anti-Semite. They're playing a bunch of language games. The policies they choose are not chosen out of principle, but convenience. And I don't want to play that game. I don't even want to give them the voice. On the other hand, if nobody takes them seriously, who's to say in 8 years, we don't, you know, who's to say, as Lenin put it with reference to the 1905 failed revolution, that was a dress rehearsal for 1917. Who's to say that there aren't people that say, you know, January 6th was just a dress rehearsal for what we got in store? How do we parse out when to take these people seriously, when to engage, how to engage, and when to say, you know what, I should just be silent?
It's a lot to take in. I just want to begin by saying that Sartre reference was awesome, and I wish I'd thought to include it in my own article because it is very true. So the language game is about getting you owned, right? So how do you get a person owned? What does this mean? For those of you who are maybe older listening to this, been using that term, and it sounds like I'm using it wrong, but the term owned is actually from gamer culture, yes, which should not surprise people because this is a young movement. And so it's kind of actually also an older gamer term. So it's like more of a millennial gamer term that's been kind of carried over. It means if you are owned, you lose terribly. All right. And you've been humiliated by the person who is owning you. And so the word own here means that you're so bad, I now own you body and soul. Right. And so to own someone is to get them to be mad. The worst thing to be in the game is mad online. That is the owned condition. And so when you are mad online, you are saying things like, how dare you say that? That's fascist. So now that I've got you to say that, you're wrong. So by writing this article, I may have put myself at risk of being permanently owned. Yet another corn cob. But the reason that I play these language games is that I'm always looking to off-ramp people. And the idea is not that I will off-ramp someone by engaging with someone online. Like I often do. I often get people who are like, why are you talking to this person? It's like, this person's talking to me.
Yeah.
They tried to own me, I guess, like I didn't care. And now they're just talking to me. So I want this to be something that they take with them so that they're slowly going to think about this conversation, maybe, so that they'll take it more seriously when they encounter some things that maybe they don't like or strike them as incorrect. But the reason why they play these games is because they're used to playing games. And so it's not an accident that they incorporate gamer language into the language game. Another thing you mentioned is despair. And of course, I agree entirely. Some of the first articles I've ever written on this subject talk about this. I think the first one I wrote about was specifically about Catholic integralism. It was called Why Catholic Integralism is an Ideology of Despair. And then I wrote a follow-up called After Republican Virtue. And the reason why I brought up Republican virtue is that is the virtue of self-government, the ability to know and choose the public good in a way that is part of a constitutional order of rules and laws. And a lot of these people have no experience with this. If they've never been habituated to that way of life, and instead they see people exploiting that way of life for gain, especially the libs, then participating in that form of government seems to be a non-starter for them. On the subject of picking winners and losers, this is usually done in a way that is extremely rigged, as you said. Fascism and all the regimes where it took root was essentially a way of institutionalizing the rigging.
Right.
The model for that was called corporatism. I don't need to tell you what that is. And we actually have open advocacy for corporatist economic policy with people like Gladden Papin in American Affairs, who also want to say that it's somehow Catholic. And in a very strange way. So that rigging is also meant to create client organizations that are institutionally loyal to the right. And so people, I think he may have said this publicly, he said this to me in a conversation, but Saurabh Sharma at American Moment was talking about creating we have this kind of petrochemical client, group. I'm not sure how true that is, but that's what he thought. And so we need to essentially create a kind of new right-aligned tech sector where you already have maybe venture capitalists and sort of errant groups that are into that sort of thing. And so when we pass the CHIPS Act, it's important that the organizations that emerge are Republican and conservative in a way that will create a kind of corporatist alliance between those two so that there can be a permanent interest there. And it's starting to sound like what you're trying to do is creating a coalition of large institutional arrangements that will hold together a permanent institutional majority. And it's not good. I know what that is. But two last things. One is why engage at all? So youth politics is based off of one of two positions. First is F you, Dad. And the other one is it's not a phase, Mom. These are your two options. These are your.
That's great.
I've been wanting to write this article for a long time. If anyone steals this, I will be very mad. But these are your two options. All right. And in the case of new right youth politics, it's not a phase, Mom. And that is, these are people who very often have like Japanese cartoons as avatars online. People often don't know where they come from, but they come from a game called Hetalia, which is an anime game in which you play as girls that represent Axis powers.
Oh boy!
It was
wow.
Yeah, I was not. Now that you know that, all of you will be a little unhappier. But just so you know, this is where it's emerging out of. That's why it's so weird, But we have to treat this as a phase. We've mentioned him on a couple times, but Jonah Goldberg always liked to joke that the golden age of Randianism is 16. And I think that's the case here, like the golden age of Catholic integralism, of, I don't know, like Franco appreciation, whatever it is that you're doing, posting Sun and Rad memes of your favorite Republican candidate. The golden age of that is really 16. And so what you do by engaging with these ideas is you take their phase seriously, right? Like you go ahead and go to the wedding with your kid dressed up in whatever music subculture outfit they have, right? Like taking the goth kid. You're like, that's fine, honey. Wear the black lipstick and the little braid piercing. I love you very much, and so and hope that you can off-road them when they get a little older and they're finally willing to admit that it's a phase. In a way, you won't ever quite get rid of it, but I think I've already started to see some people who are trying to off-road from the phase. We mentioned, how do you say his name? Hanania?
I always, I had a friend with the same last name, and it was pronounced Hanania. So that's what's my assumption.
Okay. Hanania, in fact, is trying to explain that this is what happened to him. He might be like in the transition from the phase, right? He may not be as much out of the phase as he thinks. I agree. I agreed with your assessment of the
Baby
situation.
steps.
Well, yes,
Baby
that's in the very beginning of the piece that he wrote about it, he said something about, which is, it's now clear from my writing that, I no longer believe these things. I'm like, I'm going to stop you there. It is not clear from your current writings that you don't. But this is also where I personally struggle with a lot of this because, again, because they're disproportionately young. And, while I never dabbled in, Nazi imagery or Franco love or any of that kind of stuff when I was younger. Yeah, when I was younger in my early 20s, I had some much more radical ideas, mostly in a libertarian direction, but I could understand how people who don't agree with those could look at them and be just as turned off by that set of ideas as we are by what the new right is, these new right young people are espousing now. So I want to give some grace to these people and have given them an opportunity to grow out of all of it, which is why, again, having interviewed Nate Hochman a couple of times, who personally I found very likable and charming and I think is very intelligent. And what gets me more enraged about that situation, while I think it doesn't take a lot of moral intelligence to know that referencing Nazi symbols is a bad idea, like just do not do it. I get more fit to be tied about the older people and the organizations, the institutions that have and are continuing to fail these young people in trying either not turning them away from this very online stuff, or in the worst cases, kind of encouraging it to make these young people the shock troops for this different version of the state that they are now advocating for. Again, this is not to take any responsibility off the actors individually, because ultimately you are responsible for your own actions and you should have to deal with the consequences of that. But I think we need to talk about the people in the institutions who at worst didn't try to intervene, or at best didn't try to intervene, and at worst were actively encouraging of this kind of behavior because of the benefit they and their institutions would get from it.
Oh, I can get myself in trouble with that. There are a lot of institutions that have been making the most out of this moment on the right in order to offer them up. I'm hesitant to name names, especially because there are good people at these organizations. But the problem is that they bear none of the costs. They try to habituate all of these kids to their worst instincts, or recommend to them continuing to try to own the libs rather than take ideas seriously. And then when these kids go off and make sun and rad memes, or, have incredibly anti-Semitic group chats that get leaked the second that they run afoul of someone, they're the ones that get fired, not the institutions. The institutions on the right that are doing this remain immune. And the reason for that is that they're well-heeled, or many times board members and donors don't know what's going on. That's... that might have to come to a head soon. We might have to start naming names.
One of the interesting things that's come up as we've talked about this, we've talked about sort of the human person at the heart of a lot of this stuff. We've talked about religion as something that a lot of these folks play with too. We've talked about the role of despair here. And one of the interesting things in both your piece and our conversation is we talk around the edges of religion here, but I think that there's a very key role that religion plays in this phenomenon, both historically and in the present day. And this is something that Umberto Eco wrote an essay for the New York Review of Books back in the mid-90s called Fascism. And in it, he devises a very famous list of characteristics. And the one he leads with is the one that touches on religion. And he talks about how fascism is always, there's a cult of tradition, but it's always a syncretic cult of tradition. Yeah. It's not actually any actual tradition. And I'm just going to quote a little bit here. He says, the Nazi gnosis was nourished by traditionalist, syncretic, occultic elements. The most influential theoretical source of the theories of the new Italian right, Julius Evola, merged the Holy Grail with the protocols of the Elders of Zion, alchemy with the Holy Roman and Germanic Empire. a little bit later, if you browse the shelves that in American bookstores are labeled as New Age, you can find that they're even St. Augustine, who, as far as I know, was not a fascist. But combining St. Augustine and Stonehenge, that is a symptom of Orwellianism. And I think with the weird techno-anime Roman memes and declarations of loyalty to the Pope simultaneously, you get a lot of this weird religious syncretism that undergirds this. And part of this might be just a dedication to irrationalism, as we've discussed earlier. But I think there's something else. I think there's a genuine sort of spiritual searching that seems totally unrooted and ad hoc that's behind a lot of this. And people that, in Hananiah's piece, where he talks about, his transition from these sorts of very overtly extreme to perhaps just marginally extreme right positions now, he talks about a lot of that being rooted in a self-loathing, in a crisis, and and very low self-esteem for himself at the time, this sorts of things, and a destructive path. And I see that has spiritual symptoms. I know that you've thought a lot about these issues of religious syncretism with a lot of these movements. How do you think about through this, and particularly the people that are struggling with all of these things, and often their spirituality gets thrown into it as well?
Yeah, so this is something I've thought a whole lot about, and very, very young academic paper I have right now, it really needs to be worked on, has talked about the need to appreciate the idea of the occult in political theory. And the reason for this is for, as you describe, this sort of syncretic approach to religion. The way that I open the paper is talking about two moments in Freemasonry. One is the memoir on Freemasonry that Joseph de Maistre writes, in which he talks about Masonry as the supreme science of humanity necessary to end the Reformation and return religions to a sense of unity. And the other is his fury at the French Lodge for admitting Voltaire. And Voltaire's admission, because he'd blown everything up. And it's important that it's Maistre, because Maistre, of course, is supposed to be this great defender of Catholic authority and dogma. And the guy was a Martinist. He was a really weird occult believer, which is why when you read Maistre and his defense of the Catholic Church, that has nothing to do with natural law. There's no Aquinas. None of those things mean anything to him. He regards all that as exoteric teaching necessary to control the people. And so what religion becomes for people in these environments is more, if it's not owning the libs, then what it is essentially is a way of recovering something from the past that you can use as a code, both to control other people and to adopt for your own. So it's ironically very modern, right? The attempt to recover a tradition that has nothing to do with you, like in medieval French Catholicism, and say, this is mine now. And you're like some schlub in the Columbus, Ohio suburbs. You're not gonna. Of course, you're gonna feel sad and alone. This is what you're gonna reach for. But the occult is always kind of emerging. It's not really like we need to be afraid of the lodge. That's not what I'm going for. That's actually kind of a weird element to a lot of the fascisms we're describing. Like Franco was obsessed with Freemasonry and made a big part of his early reign the extirpation of lodges. Other sort of Latin American ones felt the same way. The sort of ultimate conspiracy theory of fascism was the, I'm trying to remember how they put it. It's like the Judeo-Masonic Bolshevik sort of thing. And this is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Some people who were serious theologians wrote about it, like Julio Mainavel. It's pretty nuts. And there are people who will cite those, like, there's a guy named Father Felix Sarda Salvini, and he'll get quoted. He wrote a tract called Liberalism is a Sin. And when you put in liberalism, what you really mean there is Freemasonry and Jews. That's what he really means by that. And so when, Gladden Papin's citing this guy, it's like, ooh, it's like, oh, don't use that guy. But again, it owns the libs to do that. It's right there in the title. You're owning the libs. The religious seeking that you're seeing there is, I think you're right, very authentic. Often these are people who have maybe a kind of sense that religion can play some role in structuring the world, and they often feel like their world is very unstructured, or they themselves live lives that need structure. And so they're seeking that out. But I cannot overstate the significance of how they're coming by this religion. Often it's in like Reddit, 4chan. Like if you go to R Catholicism on Reddit, it is not a good place to learn the catechism. There's a lot of Franco. There's Dolphus, who's like marginally better. At least he wasn't like an anti-Semite, or a kook. He's just sort of an unfortunate man. But again, their games. The games are where they learn a lot of this stuff. A game called Hearts of Iron 4, they'll learn a lot of this stuff. And another one's called Europa Universalis 4, in which you can play as the Papal States, which, by the way, I've played that game and I played as the Papal States, crushing the Reformation, right? As a Catholic, you got to do it at least once. But for a lot of these people, like that's just how they, that's all they know.
So the syncretism is sort of a min-maxing sort of attempt.
That's right. You look up your game facts to find out how to maximize the early advantage the Papal States get from having rich territories. I'm giving a little away too much right now, but but they treat it as a game, right? They do treat it as a game where the religious seeking is a way to maximize their own sort of happiness and minimize their own sense of loneliness. And in the same way, people who are woke on the left often got sucked into the sort of broader wokeness by being like Harry Potter fans and seeking like fandoms out on Tumblr. You have a lot of gamers on the right who end up in this kind of weird love of Franco from playing Hoi 4 or Catholic integralism from playing EU4. They find each other by like joining Reddit and trying to get strategies for winning the game or getting certain kinds of achievements. One last thing is that the ironic posture that you get from owning the libs or what have you is not a stable one. So you either off ramp or you go serious, right? So there are going to be people who will share Sun and Rad, whatever, and they mean it. And that's because they've essentially memed themselves into Nazism or whatever. And so the seeking needs to go in the direction where they're off ramping from this craziness. As I engage Dylan, but I don't go on Reddit.
Yeah,
that's a bridge too far for me.
Yeah.
But just so you know, like if you're one of these people who's concerned about these sorts of things, dip in there. I do not suggest playing Hetalia. By the way, that game is. I just searched for it when I saw it, and I was like, okay, there's a lot going on here that I don't necessarily need to have in my life.
Yeah. We have gone very long, and we were going to talk about this David Brooks piece, but I don't think we have time for that other than I will just put it in the show notes so people can take a look at it. Dylan had made the point earlier about the Iraq War and this idea that we all know somebody who went over there, which is actually very much at the heart of David Brooks's piece, in which he is saying of these elite classes, that's not true, and that they have separated themselves in a bunch of different ways. It is a very interesting piece. I think it is David Brooks kind of at his best when he gets these kind of big picture trend things that I think he notices, does a very good job of noticing. But because they are often big generalizations, there are a lot of disagreements that you can have with it. But it's interesting and provocative, and I would encourage people to take a look at it. But we have run very long, so we will call it a wrap there. Thank you for listening to Act and Unwind. If you're listening to this podcast on our website, as James used to do, please look in the show notes for a link where you can subscribe directly to Act and Unwind, or just search Act and Unwind on your favorite podcast app. Also, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, 5-star reviews only, so that more people can find this show. Thanks to Dan, thanks to Dylan, and a special thanks to James Patterson. For the Acton Institute, I'm Eric Cohn. We'll see you next week.